So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Candy Brush to this session of Virtual Summer Seminar in Entrepreneurship Research. Dr. Brush is Professor and Franklin Olin Chair in Entrepreneurship at Babson College. She has a PhD from Boston University, honorary doctorate from a number of institutions, from Jönköping University in Sweden, and visiting research appointments at a number of institutions in Europe. She's the recipient of the Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research, informally known as the Entrepreneurship Nobel. She, along with other members of the DINA group. Some of her accomplishments, I thought about what accomplishments I can include in one slide and not spend too much time talking about that. So I'll just say this: published about 100 refereed articles, 16 books, 90 book chapters. Her work has been cited 30,000 plus times, H-index of about 80, and she's served on 27 doctoral committees. You can do the math in terms of what it means in annual productivity. I'm not even going to try. With that, let me say, Candy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Vishal. It's a pleasure to see so many people. And I assume you're from all over the world, correct? People are from all different places. And so, Vishal, I have to compliment you on putting together a seminar that I'm sure has great value, and the opportunity for people to connect and talk about research. And just to be clear, most everybody's a PhD student, is that correct? Yeah.
Say that again. Most everybody is it?
Yeah. And then maybe
there is a mix of students, peer, and junior faculty and mid-career faculty.
Excellent. Okay. Just you got to know your audience when you're going to talk to someone. So that's where I'm starting. So just a couple things that I'll add to, and thank you for that very nice introduction, Vishal. But just a couple of things. I've been at Babson for 18 years. I was at Boston University for 15 years prior to that. And before that, I was an adjunct professor at Boston College teaching marketing. While at Babson, I've served as department chair for 10 years. And then I served as vice provost of global entrepreneurial leadership, which means I was in charge of the co-curricular side of the house for 6 years. I'm actually now back in faculty teaching in the MBA program. And I'm probably best known for my research on women's entrepreneurship. Most of my work is empirical, but I've done some qualitative work, and I've done several comprehensive literature reviews. I think you read one of them as the pre-work for this session. And so I'm going to get started, and I am going to share my slides. I decided to organize this based on sort of phases of my research because honestly, Vishal, it was difficult for me to figure out what to talk about. So it's actually a really good exercise because then you have to do some self-reflection to figure out exactly, what is it that you want to say? What is your story? And so I could tell a lot of stories, but I decided to tell a story based on phases. So hopefully this will resonate with all of you. Just going to spend 1 second and let to see who's here. So I've got you. I'm looking left because you're on my left screen, and my slides are on the screen right in front of me. So anyway, so here I am, and so let's get started. So this is how I've organized my talk today. Why did I become an entrepreneurship scholar? I think my motivation for doing so, I'm going to spend some time talking about gendered women's entrepreneurship research. And I've broken this into different phases of work: the pioneering age, the building phase, the legitimating and transforming, and then I have a few final thoughts. There's two questions that people always ask me, and so I will answer those as I'm going through. And one of those questions is, why did I study entrepreneurship and why did I study women? And then the second question is, how did the Diana Project evolve? So I'll answer both of those as we go through the presentation. And so let me move forward here. So the journey begins. Okay, I have to show you a little bit about my family because being an entrepreneurial scholar is usually a family decision. I'm sure that your families were involved in the process of your getting started in your PhD programs and early phases. I was a late PhD. I didn't enter the PhD program until I was 37. I was teaching part-time marketing. And so, why did I study entrepreneurship? Well, one of the reasons I decided to study entrepreneurship was because my father actually was an entrepreneur, and so was my uncle. I had a couple of role models. And then when I was getting my MBA, I actually decided to work in the Small Business Development Center, and I also took a couple courses. And so I think that kind of inspired my, my interest in entrepreneurship. And so why women? So, it was kind of accidental. I was looking for a course at the end of my time as an MBA because I was actually expecting my second child. And so I went to an individual named Robert Hisrick, who has actually just passed away. And he was in the marketing department. And I said, I would like to do an independent study. And he said, I don't do independent studies. And he said, but I'll do one with you if you study women entrepreneurs. And so this was back in the 1980s, before we had lists, before there was anything kind of substantial about women's entrepreneurship. In fact, there was only one study that had been done on women's entrepreneurship that was published by Eleanor Brantley Schwartz. And even our government wasn't doing a very good job of keeping track of businesses that had women owners. And so, but yeah, there were 26% of all the businesses in the US were women owned at the time. And so he had a questionnaire. He'd been at MIT working with an individual named Ed Roberts, who's probably best known for technology entrepreneurship. And so he had Ed Roberts' questionnaire that he had used for surveying technology entrepreneurs. And so it took me 3 months to get the mailing list. Once I got the mailing list, we sent it to individuals in an organization called the National Association of Women Business Owners, which was a national organization, but they had no national headquarters. So I had to go state by state by state to get the mailing list. It took a lot of time. And I did get a 47% response rate. We can only dream about that now because I know that most of us don't get response rates like that. But I got a great response rate. We did a longitudinal study. We published 8 articles in a book. And so I did all of this before I got my degree. And so, just to talk briefly about my work while I was early stages. And so the real question we were interested in is, who are the women entrepreneurs? And so most of the research that we did at the time used human capital theory and motivation theory. And again, everything we knew about entrepreneurs was based on surveys and studies of men. And so there was an assumption that men and women were the same in terms of entrepreneurial behavior. And so our questions really were to try to understand, were they the same in terms of characteristics, in terms of the process, in terms of the businesses that they ran, et cetera. And we did find that there were some differences and some similarities, that the same general characteristics and motivations as men entrepreneurs, but more often they operated in service and retail, and that women-owned businesses grew more slowly, but that their experience and business skills influenced growth. These are things that we know to be fact now, but at the time this was all new. We did not know this. And so that was a whole sort of set of new information at the time, because as I mentioned, there weren't hardly any studies at the time. And so the second sort of phase really kind of gets to building a foundation, where we began to really sort of try to understand the similarities and differences between male and female entrepreneurs. And again, we're looking at gender sort of as a variable here. And this is early stage. We hadn't really brought feminist theory into trying to understand women's entrepreneurship at the time. And so a lot of my work also at this time was strategy focused, because my PhD's in strategy. In fact, when I got to Boston University, and I had in my second year as a student, I was asked to write a book chapter for OECD. They wanted me to do a lit review, and it was the commission was actually by Ms. Magazine. So this was back in the late 1989. And so I did this book chapter. It took quite a while, because I had, at that point, we didn't have any Google, we didn't have anything online. And so I actually had to go to the library and download things to microfiche, et cetera. And I wrote this book chapter, and my folks at Boston University said, well, you shouldn't study women's entrepreneurship as your thesis, because it's a subset of a subset, meaning that entrepreneurship was a subset of strategy and women's entrepreneurship was a subset of entrepreneurship. And so I did the book chapter anyway, and or the report for OECD, and then I went and shared it with a sociology professor. And this was really kind of a turning point for me, because she said, you really should study women's entrepreneurship, because there's a theory, there's lots of theories that can be applied here. There's a phenomenon of interest, and there's lots of stakeholders who care. So don't give up on it. And those words and that validation of something that I was passionate about and curious about was really important. So of course I did my dissertation on international entrepreneurship, and I continued to do work on strategy. But that sort of validation early on in my career, I think, was a catalyst for me to move forward. And so the work that was done, sort of between 1990 and 2005, perhaps the most important article, people often ask you, what are you most proud of? And if I were to ask Vishal that, which article are you most proud of? He probably has one or two articles he was proud of. And so one of these I was very proud of, and this is the 1992 literature review. In fact, I went back and read it. I haven't read it for a long time, and it was like, I did that, I wrote that, that was really pretty good. And so I actually, what I did is I did the first literature review on women's entrepreneurship. And again, hard copy of articles, it took me a long time. The article was published in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, went through 4 rounds of review, 2 different editors. It took a long time to get there. And what I did is I looked at all of the research that had been done on women's entrepreneurship and compared what we knew about women entrepreneurs to what was known about men entrepreneurs. But the real sort of takeaway was that I tried to explain why there were unique differences between men and women entrepreneurs. And I came up with this notion of an integrated perspective. And so I suggested that women see their businesses differently. They don't see it as a separate economic unit. They see it as a cooperative network of relationships. And so this conception I called an integrated perspective, which I might have chosen a better word if I'd had more time to think about it. But anyhow, the whole idea was to offer an explanation for why we were seeing differences in terms of the kinds of organizations women were building, the differences in some of the motivations, skills, and behaviors. And so also around that time, I worked with Barbara Bird, who's probably best known for her work on entrepreneurial behavior. And so we extended some of that work to look at a gendered perspective on organizational creation. And it was about this time I started working on the Diana Project. We actually started collecting the data, but we hadn't launched the Diana Project per se. And so my friend and colleague, Patty Green, had managed to get access to all the investments in venture capital funded businesses in the US for almost a 40-year period. And so we started coding that data and trying to analyze it based on the sex of the CEO. And you can imagine it was very tedious. First of all, it was like a paper. We had a database, like an Excel spreadsheet, but it was all arrayed, in a bad form. So it really took us a long time to do that. And so, second question, why Diana Project? And so the 5 of us launched the Diana Project in 1998. And I'm going to tell you a little story. And so how did we decide to do this? So I'm going to take you to Coronado, California. So imagine it's been an entrepreneurship conference. You're on the beach, the sun is setting, and people are coming out of the entrepreneurship social. We're standing on the beach. The waves are lapping at your feet, and you're having this wonderful conversation and just talking about, what you might do. So we're probably 8 or 10 of us. I honestly don't remember who else was in the group. I have a few memories. And we started thinking, wouldn't it really be fun to work together? And how can we do something that will really help to bring women's entrepreneurship to the forefront? And is there something that we could do that would make a difference? And so at the time, there was a little bit of work going on. And so Myra Hart threw out this statistic. And Myra said, did you know that 1,200 firms received venture capital in 1996, and only 30 were women-led? And so it was kind of like, wow. And we knew that there were $33 billion in VC that had been invested. And this was sort of the boom of the venture capital area. This was like 1996. And so, so Nancy Carter says, well, why don't we get together and write a grant proposal? Let's go to Santa Fe, New Mexico. So, of course, we all kind of looked around, and she said, who's in? And there were 5 of us that raised our hands. And it was me, Myra, Betsy Gatewood, Patty Green, and Nancy Carter. And so I want to just emphasize, I knew Patty quite well. We'd met as PhD students. I knew Myra somewhat. And I knew Betsy, but we didn't all really know each other very well. And so, but we all did have different disciplinary strengths. Patty's a sociologist and had studied minority entrepreneurship. Nancy was really well known for her work in strategy. She's written several articles published in SCJ on strategy and performance. And then Betsy Gatewood actually was a psychologist, and she at the time was running the Small Business Development Center. Myra Hart was at Harvard Business School and actually was trained in case study method and had been doing her work. She was actually a co-founder of Staples, so she was a late PhD also. So we had different backgrounds. So we stayed at a B&B. We worked on this grant proposal. We went to museums in the afternoon, and we came up with a grant proposal that had these two core objectives, which is to provide a platform from which to develop and conduct and share a global research agenda on women's entrepreneurship, and to develop an international community of scholars dedicated to answering the questions about women entrepreneurs and growth of their businesses. And so in other words, we really wanted to catalyze change through collaborative research, and we felt that having a research community would be a great way to do that. And so we had a vision. And so from that, we created what I would call a research program. You know, we oftentimes think of our work as a paper, but we created a research program with several pieces to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And so the other question I always get asked is why Diana? And so we named it Diana Project because there were 5 of us, 5 different institutions. And so it just seemed like if we named the project, then it would be easier for people to identify exactly what we were doing. And we named it Diana because Diana was a hunter, not a gatherer. And when you're hunting for money, you're a hunter. So that's where the history of that comes in. And so we sent this proposal to the Kauffman Foundation. We asked for $500,000, which at that time was a lot of money. They gave us $250,000, so that was good because we were happy with that. And so anyway, so we moved forward from the sort of launch of the Diana Project in 1998. And the questions we were interested in really had to do with why do women receive such a tiny proportion of venture capital? And we made the deliberate choice to study women at the top end of the funding spectrum and the stage of development spectrum, because that's where there was the least information, and that's where the biggest problem or challenge was in how do you get growth capital. And so, and again, this was during the boom of venture capital when, you know, people were writing business plans in a half an hour and getting money the next day. And so our proposal included 2 dimensions. We proposed to study the supply side by mapping the venture capital industry, all the investments and all the people in the industry, and the demand side, in other words, those seeking capital. And as I mentioned, we had this data set of all the investments in the US over a 30-year period. And so we had the population of all firms that were venture capital funded in the US for 30 years. And we also then hand mapped the entire venture capital industry to understand the investment side of the equation as well, which meant identifying all the people, all the investment firms, and the amounts of money that all of those firms had invested. So we had both pieces, and it took a massive amount of time, but there were 5 of us, so that was the helpful thing there. And so, so that's kind of the history of where we are. So let's see here. I just want to make sure I'm on the right slide here. So what did we use? We used really social and human capital theory in this, as well as context theory. And we published some articles that, you know, sort of shared information about both the supply side and the demand side. And what we found, of course, is that women VCs were small in number and less often to move in decision-making roles. In fact, we found that women VCs in 1996 to 2000 oftentimes were leaving the industry, and only about 92% of all of the partners in the venture capital industry at the time were female. And so again, our hypothesis was that women investors would invest in women-led ventures. And we did find this to be the case in some respects. Most of that work was qualitative because there really weren't very many investors, and there weren't that many women firms that were invested in. So Myra actually did more than 50 interviews with investors in Silicon Valley, and we also did many interviews with entrepreneurs. We did a major lit review of all the venture capital and on everything on venture capital for up to 1998. We also collected additional data besides the venture capital data that we had, in that we ran a couple of surveys where we surveyed women that were seeking capital, that had sought capital and received capital, and those that had not sought capital, sort of a three-way comparison. And then we did a couple of other surveys of those women who had received venture capital. There was an organization called the Springboard Venture Capital organization. It was venture capital, Springboard Venture Capital firm. It wasn't a firm, it was an organization. And they were sponsoring workshops for women entrepreneurs seeking capital. In 2003, we also created an international community. We had our first conference in 2003. And it was through there that I met Andrew Bruin and Frederica Welter. And so another key piece of our work was some special issues. And so with Frederica and Anne, we proposed a 5M framework, which was a way of contextualizing women's entrepreneurship, market money management, meso macro environment, and motherhood. And the idea was to sort of bring to the forefront that women's entrepreneurship in particular was embedded. Now, I know that there's some scholars that have used this framework, and actually one of the adaptations is to change motherhood to family, which makes it a little bit more generic, and I actually like that improvement a lot. And then we examined all the current literature. I worked with Jennifer Jennings, whom I actually met for the first time in 2003 at our first conference. And I think you read that piece, but our motive there was really to demonstrate that it was not just what women's entrepreneurship was taking from the entrepreneurship field, but also what we could learn from women's entrepreneurship. And so, so that's kind of the legitimating phase, what we were doing at that period of time. And this is one of the conferences that we had. And again, our goal was to provide a forum where we could develop an international community of scholars. And doing this through the conferences, we have actually our next conference is next week, but this was at Babson College in 2019. But another thing that we did that I think is important for legitimation is that while a lot of our work was published in scholarly journals, we also published some reports. And again, remember, we were trying to draw attention to women's entrepreneurship as a research area and to catalyze change in terms of the investment process. So we wanted to reach the investment community and let them know what we had found in terms of our research so that we could catalyze change and hopefully increase those numbers of women receiving venture capital. And so we used, again, social capital, again, the network theory, human capital, and entrepreneurial finance theory. And we published a series of reports. And they were, one was on the supply side, which was gatekeepers of venture capital. One was on the myths about women, the homogeneity of entrepreneurs receiving venture capital, pointing out that women had differences. And then we replicated the study from that we did in 1995 to 1999, again in 2011. And we found that sadly not much had changed because there were only 3% of all CEOs were female that received venture capital, and only 15% of all venture capital funded firms had one woman on the team. And again, those were the population of all venture capital investments. And I'll just say one thing. You can get this data today on PitchBook, or you can get it Crunchbase, whatever, but they did not code it the same way we did. Because if you go into PitchBook, which is the source of our data, and you search on a list of investors, you get angels, you get corporate venture capital, you get private equity, you get individual super angels, you get foundations. And so we had to clean that data, and we were only looking at active institutional venture capital firms, which is really a small number. So it was really only at the time about 1,000 active institutional venture capital firms. So the coding of the data was really, really important, and it took hours and days to do that. And as you can see, the number of partners in VC firms had not changed either. And so just to put this in perspective, so again, we needed to speak to the academic community because we wanted to share, the work that we had done and let the academic community know this was a research area that needed to be further explored. But we also wanted to speak to the practitioner community, and that's the reason for the reports. And I can tell you that one of my surprises is when we released the 2014 report, that report got 1 billion media imprints, not 1 million, but 1 billion. And I didn't believe our PR people. And I said, I want to see it. They sent me 3 days of the imprints and the citations, the media sites. It was 73 pages long. And I said, okay, I believe you. And so, so again, trying to draw attention to, here's a phenomenon, here's a problem, here's a group of entrepreneurs that are really not receiving their fair share of venture capital. What can we do about it? And so anyhow, so I think for research, it needs to be relevant. And I think that's something that we've always worked on, is having relevance for our research. So let me move on. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I have a few more slides here. And so I also want to just mention that I did a lot of work on the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics. And I mentioned this because this is another population of women entrepreneurs that I've studied a lot. So I mentioned I'm studying those that have received venture capital up here, which is the late stage venture funded large companies. But I also was very much involved in studying nascent entrepreneurs and how early stages of entrepreneurship emerge. And that panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics, or PSED, was one of the first studies to do that. And that subsequently became the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, with many kudos to Paul Reynolds, who was the visionary for both PSED and for the GEM project. And again, I show this slide because almost everybody in this picture was intimately involved in the PSED. Connie Marie Gagley on the front row and Barbara Berg were not as involved, but everybody else was very much in the early stages of PSED. And so, but this was also really important for our understanding of entrepreneurs, because we were looking at behaviors. We weren't going to government data and saying how many people own businesses. We're looking at the behaviors and the actions entrepreneurs use to start their businesses. And so I did several studies of using PSED data, mostly working with 2 former PhD students of mine, Linda Edelman and Tatiana Manolova. And one thing that I want to mention here, again, we used expectancy theory and organizational creation theory here for this. And we did do some comparative looking at men and women, what their motivations were using PSED data. But the other thing that we did, which again, this is the second paper I'm really proud of, is a paper that we did called Properties of Emerging Organizations. And for that paper, we took a framework developed by Jerry Katz and Bill Gartner, and we actually tested it empirically. So they had come up with a conceptual idea, which included 4 properties of new organizations: boundary, intention, resources, and exchange. And we tested it using the PSED data. And then we replicated it 3 times. And so replication is not something that's done a lot in entrepreneurship, but it's something that you as early stage doctoral students could do. And actually, there's a lot of value in understanding, if you get the same results with the same studies, et cetera. It's done a lot in the hard sciences, not as much in entrepreneurship. But that's the second paper that I'm very proud of, because, and it hasn't been as well cited as some of the other papers, but I really like the fact that we tested something that had never been tested before, and then we replicated it a couple of other times. And so just a quick sort of summary of the Diana timeline. And this just shows kind of the milestones that we hit. This is a little bit more like a business presentation here. We found in 1998, we had our first annual international conference with 23 scholars. In 2003, our first international conference, 2004, the key reports that came out. By 2005, we had 3 of the founders at Babson. Patty Green was then the provost, and Myra Hart was actually on the board of trustees, and I was a department chair there. So we were working together there. And then we started our biannual conferences to 2012, and now we have an annual conference every year. And so just some milestones that we've hit, and I do not take credit for this. We have a tremendous group, and I would say the 23 early founders are people that you probably know and have heard of. All of them, many of them were, junior scholars like yourself, and now they've all been promoted. They're full professors and endowed chairs, like Frederica Welter or Colette Henry or Helen Neergaard. Jennifer Jennings, Dev Jennings was early involved too, so several of those folks were very much involved. So these are some of the things that we are proud of in the last several years. And importantly, one other thing that we did to try to catalyze change in the field was to build the research stream of women's entrepreneurship. We did this through special issues. And this is, again, a lot of work, as Vishal knows, and maybe some of the rest of you know. But we tried to make sure that that the area of women's entrepreneurship was included in top journals. And we did this by having conferences that had certain themes and then tried to attach the theme to a special issue of a journal. The most recent one was in Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. We looked at catalyzing change and innovation in women's entrepreneurship. And one of the benefits of these special issues is that it increases the manuscript flow into those journals, and it also helps the reviewers to become more familiar with the field of women's entrepreneurship. So that's something else that we did a lot. Just quickly, he mentioned the Global Award, and again, we were proud to be there with some, giants in the field, Paul Reynolds and Howard Aldrich. Magnus Aronson in the middle was really our advocate. He's held the first Diana conferences in Sweden. And if we think about Diana today, we've institutionalized it as a research institute. It's a membership organization. We have 200 plus members from all over the world. We've got, 39 countries. The majority of our members are non-US. If anybody's interested, you can talk to me about that after the session. And we offer a research conference. We have an impact day. We do a report. We do the GEM Women's Report. We have a membership organization, do quarterly roundtables, and we have some sessions on thought leadership. And so my advice, get to the things that I think are important. Back to my early story, ask big questions that someone cares about. I think that validation by Merrill Lewis for me to study something that was a big question that someone cared about was really important. Question assumptions. I mean, this really comes directly out of our work with the Diana Project. If there's assumptions about homogeneity of entrepreneurs, you want to question those. If there's assumptions about something in a theory, question that. Learn how to do a competent analytical literature review. That's something I've done several lit reviews, but learning how to do a lit review for a paper, not just a literature review paper, is really critical in learning how to hone your skills as a scholar. Intentionally construct your scholarly identity. And this is something that I think is really important, is that as a scholar, you have your conferred identity, of course, which is, your parents, who you are, where you came from, all those kinds of things. But we as academics, early stage, we have the opportunity to construct who we are. And we do this by determining what kind of work we're going to publish, where we're going to publish it, who we're going to be connected to, what conferences we're going to attend, and how we're going to spend our time. And so think about what kind of scholar you really want to be. And I think for me, I wanted to be a scholar that did rigorous work that had impact, and the impact both in scholarship and also in the community. And so the decisions that I made in terms of which conferences I would attend and who I would co-author with and what kinds of papers I would write were very much at the forefront as I was constructing my scholarly identity. And most important, it's fun. You have to have fun with what you do. And I'm sure you're having fun in this seminar and in your studies. And so we had fun. And this is just one final picture to show you how much fun we had. This is the ice bar in Sweden. If you ever get there, it's really a lot of fun. And so that's all I have for the presentation. And I'm more than happy to open this up for discussion, questions, etc. And so let me stop sharing and bring you back to cancel.
Yeah. So Candy, at this time, I'll invite folks to raise their hand or type their question in the chat box, and we'll invite those. But let me start with one question, and then we'll move on to
Sure.
other folks. One of the things we read in your Jennings and Brush paper is that even though the number of women entrepreneurship papers at top journals have increased, the proportion has decreased. Why do you think that has happened despite all these efforts?
Yeah. Well, so again, that was 2014. I would argue that things have changed a little bit. That there probably is more. In fact, I'm doing a paper right now with Frederica Welter, and one of the things I wanted to know was how many literature reviews have been done since 2002, and I counted 85. And so I think that might be different today than it was in 2014. And one of the reasons I think that it's changed is because we're starting to see a lot of work done in the Middle East and the Global South. There's great efforts on the policy front to try to encourage women's entrepreneurship. And as a result, I think we're seeing scholars starting to do that work. Some of the proposals we had, the papers that we've looked at through the Diana conference, I've read all that. We had 138 abstracts submitted. I think I read every one of them. And again, we're starting to see a lot of new work emerging. So I would argue that that proportion has probably changed.
Wonderful. Glory, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, Professor Gupta, thank you so much for the opportunity. Good afternoon, ma'am. Okay, so my question is, I have 3 questions, I'll be quick. So the Babson College releases a study called the Project Monitor, which I'm sure you know about. So it came up with a finding
I'm only getting every other word. Maybe you could put it in the chat. And
okay, all right, that's fine.
I know sometimes our internet connections can be fuzzy, and we never know when that's going to happen.
Nate,
I'll answer it when I see it.
Yeah, thank you. So a question on one of your last comments about the importance of the literature review and honing those skills. So specifically the one that you would include in a research paper, so not a literature review paper, but just any tips. I know as like a PhD student, I'm always a little intimidated about selecting who to cite and this fear of like, I'm missing one of the big ones. Like, what are some of the strategies when you've developed your topic, you kind of know partially what literature you want to speak to, but just tackling, like making sure you cover your ground properly, and any tips for writing that literature review as part of a bigger paper? Okay, so I have a couple thoughts. So first of all, your research question should drive your lit review. So whatever your question is, your independent variable, dependent variable, and then the theory that you're using to study it. So those are sort of the boundaries for your lit review. I confess I do a spreadsheet every time I write a paper. And it's not necessarily comprehensive, it's usually representative, but I'll start with the papers that are the most important, and then I will go to the bibliographies of those papers and pull out what I need to make sure that I have covered most of the bases. And the reviewers will let you know if you've missed something substantial, but I mean, I'm working on an R&R right now. A lot of my work right now is in entrepreneurship education. And so the idea of the paper is looking at how faculty, how entrepreneurship educators develop their entrepreneurial identity or their scholarly identity in the classroom, and how they choose their pedagogies. And so we had to go and look at the education literature to better understand that, and to pull the theories out of there, because there's really no theories in entrepreneurship education about, you know, how faculty choose pedagogy. So the research question we had drove the lit review. So do a spreadsheet, and my spreadsheet always has, you know, certain headings. It's got the date, the authors, the research question, the theory, the sample, the method, and the findings. And I see Vishal going like this because so that spreadsheet becomes like the foundation. And it takes a lot of time. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, could you use Chat GPT to do your lit review? And I'm thinking, well, you could, but I don't know if that would give you the depth that you need, because
you know, when you're reading the paper, you have to identify assumptions, and you've got to look at the findings and say, well, you know, if it's a theory paper, you know, what assumptions are they making about the theory? If it's an empirical paper, you have to make sure, you know, what's the sample, and does it only apply to people living in Borneo? So anyway, so those are just some tips. Let the research question drive you. Make sure you have whatever the theory is, and do a spreadsheet.
Perfect. Siva, you want to go next? Siva?
Hello, sir. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Candida, firstly, for the wonderful detailed presentation. And my question is related to your article about entrepreneurial intention and gender, please. I see actually that you recommend the fuzzy set qualitative analysis method, and you also talked about the structural equation modeling. And for my research model, I'm combining the theory of planet behavior and the institutional theory to predict the entrepreneurial intention. I have several independent variables and several mediators. For that, unfortunately, I'm in the final stage that I can't go for the fuzzy set method. I'm using the SAM. I wanted to ask for your advice to analyze my model. Is it better to use the PLS SAM method in the same model, or just analyze my relations or my hypothesis separately in separate models?
So it's hard for me to answer that question without reading the paper, because it would be hard for me to answer that question without seeing the paper, because I need to know the logic you're using and why you have decided to choose this method versus that method. I think I'd want to know the sample. I'd want to know a little bit more about it. And I'm happy, if you want to send me the paper, I'd be happy to take a look at it. I didn't do the physical analysis. I work with another co-author who's a mathematician, and he's an expert at FSQCA. And he actually, but I'm happy to take a look at the paper and put you in touch with Shirok if that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to share with you. And yeah, I'm waiting for your feedback. I will share it with you.
Okay, thank you, Suwar.
Thank you.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great.
I'll do that, Candy. And Miva, do you have a question?
Yes. Yeah, nice to meet you, Candy.
How are you? Nice to see you again.
Yes, it's so great to see you again. It's already been a year, actually, since we last met.
Right. Time flies. It feels like 20 minutes.
I know, exactly. Now I'm based in Switzerland, German part. And I've been so fortunate to be surrounded by supportive people who've been so supportive of my research on female entrepreneurship. But I don't know if it's the political climate that's going against this woke culture, this all type of discourse around it, but also probably because I'm in this German part of Switzerland where I see a lot of backlash since this whole discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I personally feel kind of concerned now because it's not just a lot of white male scholars not being interested in female entrepreneurship or DEI literature in general, but I've seen a lot of antagonism as well. And I was just wondering if you have felt the same way. Do you see any potential impact on female entrepreneurship research going forward? And how do we fight that? How do we get more men involved, interested in promoting this together?
It's a really good question. I am aware of some of the backlash, particularly in more of in the practical sense, in terms of companies, businesses, that sort of thing. I haven't seen as much of that. Of course, I'm in a rarefied environment. I'm at a Babson College where, entrepreneurship is the only thing we think about. And so so my perspective may be jaded by that, but I am aware that there is some backlash. And so I think my approach on this, and this kind of goes back to the special issues, is to do the best research you can, the most rigorous research you can, because if you do quality research, it doesn't matter what the topic is. And so if you do the best research you can, and again, it might mean that you need to work with some more senior scholars or people that have a little bit more experience, and then try to publish in the top journals that you can. Now, that being said, I hate to say it, but you probably should have, I should just say this anyway. You should always have more than one research stream. You should always have, I think when I was a PhD student, well, actually, when I was going up for tenure, my department chair said, when you go up for tenure, people are going to look at the piles of articles that you have. And you probably don't want more than 3, but you do want at least 2. And so how high are those piles? If you have 25, then people will say, who is this person? What is your scholarly identity? So my advice is do your women's entrepreneurship research or gender research, but have something else that you also do well. And then for the women's entrepreneurship research, try to do the best research you can. And again, that goes back to why we did the special issues and why we tried to find journals to publish special issues that had the best impact factors, because that would bring along the next generation of scholars. If they could get something into a special issue for SEJ, that is a legitimating factor, which is why I used that word, because you're legitimating if you publish something in a special issue about women's entrepreneurship at SEJ, people will say it's an SEJ publication, looking at the quality of the publication and maybe be a little bit more forgiving about the topic. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. I don't have an answer to the sociological challenges that we may face, but I think from your personal standpoint, that might be advice on how to handle it.
And Candy, if I may add something, Alice Eagley recently, or a few years ago, published an interesting article, and so did Renee Adams. And both of them made the same point, that rigor, rigor, rigor.
Yeah.
If your research is rigorous, top journals will publish it.
Exactly.
And they both said, when you're doing these, when you're writing these papers, don't be an advocate, be a scientist.
That's exactly right. And I'm glad you said that, Vishal, because I have reviewed papers that are, that are advocating, and they are not, there's no tension in the paper because it's only one side of the story. And that's not what you want to do. You want to really approach it and really try to get at, is this really a problem? A lot of times people will say, you study women's entrepreneurship, well, why is it better? It's not that it's better. In fact, there may not be any differences in some cases. And again, we have to be careful about the differences language because the field has evolved now. And one of the problems with looking at male-female differences is we've got this deficit model. And the deficit model means women are not living up to whatever this standard is. And that's really problematic. And so that's been one of the things I've been saying a lot of is let's stop looking at differences between men and women. Let's look at differences among groups of women and understand the intersectionality. Let's understand what the differences are among groups of women and then how they matter. And then, so there's other things that we can do. And I know Vishal has done some of this. He's done some landmark work really on stereotypes that has really, I think, furthered the field in so many ways. I've cited many of his papers and I know a lot of people have. So thank you, Vishal, for your work. Mandy, you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your academic journey with us. This is really inspiring for our junior scholars. I'm very glad that you mentioned about the importance of doing a good lit review. And I'm at a stage now, if I have my Excel sheets with all those papers, but now my struggle is, how do you organize them into maybe smaller conversations? And after building those facts, how do you spot the gap or know where knowledge is lacking? So I'm really struggling with that.
So in one way that I have done that, I mean, obviously co-authors are good because they can take a look at it and you can talk about it together. But I've actually drawn a little bit from qualitative research methods on that. Is, look, how do you, there's approaches you can do where you identify themes and you kind of carry it out, because you do want to kind of collapse these into themes that, are either for or against. And again, this kind of goes back to my last comment, is that the studies that you look at for whatever purposes for your lit review, they're not all going to agree with each other. And so you want to make sure that you've identified those that support one argument or don't support one argument, those that fit with this theory or don't fit with this theory. And so you really, because a really good article is going to have tension, and you want to make sure that you capture that through the lit review. And again, another question to ask is, what's missing as you look through the data. So you have to force yourself to ask questions about the data that you have. What's missing? What's the other side of the story? What are the assumptions that are built into these research studies? Those are sort of the three questions that I have. You want to, what's the dark side? What's the conflict? And so, in fact, I have a little sticky note that I have right here that has those questions on it. It's right by my computer, because when I'm going through my lit reviews, and actually when I'm writing a paper, I always want to know, what's surprising? What is surprising about what you see in that lit review, or what's missing? Those are the questions that I ask. So you can borrow a little bit methodologically from qualitative methods, because essentially what you have is your qualitative data. I hope that helps.
That helps a lot. If it's possible, I want to have another follow-up questions. I've always heard
Randy,
people.
in the interest of time, can we wait and then come back to you? Because that way everyone gets a chance.
Yes.
So
Okay.
Angelo, you want to go next?
Can I just respond to Glory's question really quick, because it's in the chat, and then I'll come to Angelo. So Glory, you asked a question about the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and I don't know if you're referring to the Women's Report or if you're referring to the overall global report, but I can actually answer the question about why the female entrepreneurship rates are high in sub-Saharan Africa. The part of it is because it's necessity-based entrepreneurship. People are starting businesses because they have no other means of employment. But the other piece of the equation is, do they sustain over time? And so they have a higher failure rate, even though they have a higher startup rate in certain parts of Africa. And that does change, by the way, because we've now found in the latest Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report that many of the, particularly in Kenya, I think Nigeria, and I can't remember one other country, there are more growth-oriented entrepreneurs in some of those countries. Just to back up, Global Entrepreneurship Monitor is a multi-country study where the same questionnaire is used in countries. There are some countries that come into the survey and out of the survey, so there's different. One year there might be 52 countries, the next year there might be 75. But if you go to Global Entrepreneurship Monitor or GERA.org, GERA is the organization that manages, there's country reports, you can look at the country reports. And the second question, did Diana study? No, we did not. We did not do a multi-country survey. We never did a survey that was used. It's very expensive, very hard, very time consuming to do that. So our Diana studies, we have collaborated by sharing questionnaires with each other. So a lot of times somebody in one country will share their questionnaire with somebody else, or they'll share data, et cetera. And so we see collaborations, but there's no formal multi-country survey. And then, is there a difference in success of a female entrepreneur when she has a female mentor? I don't know that anybody's actually done that study. That's something that, maybe you could do that study, Glory. How do successful female entrepreneurs leverage efficiency and time management? And I don't know the answer to that empirically. I mean, I could speculate, but I don't know the answer to that. So hopefully I captured those questions. So that's good.
Before you answer Angelo's question, let me mention something about what she said about mentor, right? Female mentor versus male mentor. That could be done sort of through a survey, but it could also be done sort of experimentally in some ways, right? So I think Glory is onto something with that research question.
I think, because again, and I agree, Vishal, that's a great question to explore because, there's all sorts of aspects to mentoring, whether they're peer mentors, whether it's a senior, junior, whether they're junior, junior, et cetera. So whether it's formal mentoring or informal mentoring. I think Kathy Cram, who used to work with at Boston University, is probably one of the experts on mentoring. And she's written a book on mentoring. It would be a good place to start just by understanding the whole mentoring space.
Wonderful. Angelo, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you very much, Professor Candida. My question is about, I am living in rural Australia and there is an increase in female-only business networks. So I found that there are around 132 female business networks that are created for different purposes.
Wow.
There are ones in particular that are created to support women entrepreneurs. And I read some papers saying like this when these networks exist that support just women, what they do is they marginalize, they ghettoize. Instead of supporting, what they are doing is reinforcing that women are different. So I actually had the chance to talk to the leader and the founder of one of these mentors in rural Australia. And it was very interesting because all the mentors, and answering some of the questions, all the mentors are rural women entrepreneurs. The women that are supported, they don't want to relate to women from metropolitan cities. They don't want to learn from men. They just want to learn from rural women. And the answer or the rationale is that they want to do so because women from metropolitan areas will not understand our issues. They are not understand our context. They will not understand how we feel. And it took me, so it was very challenging to and controversial as well. And it's increasing the number of these female-only business networks. So what is your opinion on this?
So I think what you've just said is really interesting. In fact, this would be another topic we're studying from the standpoint that you're getting at intersectionality. You're getting at the intersection between economics and gender. And that would be a fascinating thing to explore in more detail. Because I think what you might be finding, so even women to women, it's the rural urban, aspect or the economics of it that makes a difference. I know that Australia is very progressive in terms of lots of networks. Australia has one of the higher rates of women's entrepreneurship in the world, if you again go back to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and they've been really supportive of women's entrepreneurship in terms of policy. As far as the specific networks and marginalization, I just don't know enough about the nature of the networks and what they do and where they are to have a real strong opinion about it. But it sounds like if you're looking for a research question, that would be really interesting to study, is that intersection between gender and economics in terms of mentoring support and effectiveness.
Thank you. And I was looking at identity, trying to incorporate identity theories because they identify with a particular, or they develop a particular identity, rural women entrepreneurs, that differentiates them from urban female entrepreneurs. And this urban rural is also
yeah, you've got a really interesting area for further research, so go for it.
Thank you, Professor.
Wonderful. Umesh, you have a question?
Yes, Professor. Thank you for the insightful presentation, Dr. Candida. I'm from India, Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. I'm interested in entrepreneurship education. I have been involved in India with the entrepreneurship cells to propagate the entrepreneurship education for the last couple of years. But when I look at the PhD opportunities, there are not many programs which offer entrepreneurship education topic as for PhD. And when I look at Babson, I've been attending a lot of 1-hour seminars which are conducted since last 3 to 4 years to gain insights into entrepreneurship education and what kind of tools to be used. But why Babson does not have a PhD program in entrepreneurship? That's first of the question. And second, if I have to do entrepreneurship education PhD related topic, where would you suggest me to go?
Oh, okay. So you're asking why Babson doesn't have a PhD in entrepreneurship? I wish I knew. No, actually, it's something that we have talked about for years, and it's very expensive to mount a PhD program. We're a small school. We've only got, roughly a little over 3,000 students, and we have not, we just haven't been able to move that forward. We do have the Price Babson C program, which actually just ended yesterday, which is a one-week program designed to help educators develop their entrepreneurship teaching skills. And if you're interested in that, I can certainly tell you more. And that is actually a really robust program. And then we also have something called the Babson Collaborative, which is a membership organization where schools can join, schools that are interested in developing their entrepreneurship education programs. And so I can send you the links for both of those. It's called Babson Collaborative. And then the other one is Price Babson C. Both of these are run through the Babson Academy. Part of Babson is run. The lead faculty is Professor Heidi Neck, who's really well known for her textbooks and entrepreneurship education.
Thanks, Candy. Lucia, do you have a question?
Professor Gupta, thank you. Thank you, Professor Candida, for your talk. I am right now working on trying to measure or assess the entrepreneurial mindset. I was wondering if you could provide me with recommendations if it is already being explored, if the cognition side or the men and women are different, and if that's something interesting to approach, and in case you have a suggestion or recommendation to explore, that would be great.
So I'm not sure I have recommendations. I can tell you that Kelly Shaver, who is a social psychologist, has developed an instrument called Mindset, MINDCETTE. And he's had some success. There's lots of people in the database that have used that. I can tell you personally that I think it's very hard, it's a very individual thing. And I guess the question is, why do we want to measure it? I'll tell you personally, when I teach an MBA class on entrepreneurship, what really matters to me is if the student can walk out at the end of the class and say, I believe I'm more entrepreneurial. That's what really matters to me, is on a one individual basis, that if they feel they have become more entrepreneurial, then I have done my job. But if I were to measure them pre-post, I may not get that sense of confidence and that sense of action that they want to take. So I always design my classes so that students have to do activities that force them to do things that are entrepreneurial, however that is defined. Because the mindset is obviously contextualized. It could be in a corporate venture, a family venture, it could be an initiative, a nonprofit. And so, and just as an example, and I know we're up against the clock here, I had my last MBA class, I teach a core entrepreneurship class, and it's essentially a feasibility analysis course, 7 weeks online. And I had 17 scientists in the class from Pfizer, they were in biotech, healthcare. And so I thought, well, my hope was I would get really, really great business ideas or feasibility ideas. I didn't, but that's another story. But at the end of the class, because they were all trained, many of them had 15, 20 years looking at a microscope. Most of them walked out of the class and said, I think in a more entrepreneurial way because of this class. And so for me, that was validation. But I can put in the name of this. This is Professor Kelly Shaver. You can look at his work. That might be an instrument that you could be interested in.
Thank you, Professor Candida.
Candy, I know we asked you for 45 minutes or so, and we are already past the 1 hour mark. So let me finish with the last question here. when I see your record over the past several years, I see outstanding researcher, institution builder like the DINA project, top, you've taken administrative positions, you've mentored junior researchers, served as positive role models for many of us. What is one advice you would give to people who are trying to make their name in entrepreneurship research, junior scholars, PhD students, or even mid-career professors who want to make their name in entrepreneurship research?
Well, again, I think it really comes down to some, as I said, self-reflection, figure out, what role you want to play in the field. And you don't all have to be, top researchers. You may choose to be on the, run a center or be on that side. But whatever it is, you have to, because the choices you make are going to define who you are and what your role is. But just be cognizant and intentional about the choices you make, because if you're going to try to attend, and I'll back up for a second. I think a lot of times scholars, early stage scholars, get caught up in having to publish in a top journal, and that becomes their only goal. And by doing that, you lose sight of who you are and what you care about and what kind of research is important. Yes, it's important to do rigorous research, but if you set your sights at only publishing in a top journal, that's an outcome. That's not the research process, and that's not really answering a research question. And, because I've read tenure packages of people who are published, they have 8 top publications, but they're on 8 different topics, and they don't have any scholarly identity. So figure out who you want to be. Make those choices based on the conferences you attend, the people you co-author with, and what your identity is, and be intentional about it. I think that's probably the most thing. I mean, because there were lots of things, like I made choices when I was an assistant professor. I always say I had a family because you saw the pictures, but I said I will never teach in the summer because that was my family time. And then I would only go to 3 conferences a year. And I was very deliberate about, the amount of time I would spend on things. Even when I was writing papers, I would say, I have 6 hours to do this, and that's it. Because when you got 3 kids, it's like chaos. And so I was very, very disciplined. I'm disciplined with my calendar. For example, if people wanted to meet with me about something that was kind of outside my research area, I'd say I have open office hours between these hours. I'll see you then, but I'm not going to make a special appointment. So you really have to be intentional and disciplined.
Perfect. Thank you, Candy.
Thank you, Vishal. This was a blast.
Taking the time to visit with everyone today. This was great.
It was nice to see you all and meet you all. Best wishes with whatever you do. I hope I bump into you at a conference somewhere.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Vishal. I'll see you at AOM or somewhere else.